So Rose said I'm supposed to make a statement. What the agenda says, we're supposed to talk about how to draft policy and legislation.
No, do that.
That's what you're looking for, right?
Yeah, that was.
Okay.
I was just sort of introducing the whole presidential thing, but I'm here to talk about drafting policy and legislation.
And we have 20 minutes. So there are 2 points I want to emphasize and talk a little bit about, and then maybe we do some question and answer. First thing is plain English. When you're drafting policy, and even when you're doing bills, you want it so the average person you're trying to mobilize can understand what the hell you're trying to do. So that's number one. The other thing is, in developing this, don't just think you know the answers. You got to go out and talk to people about what their concerns are, what their solutions are to whatever problem that we're addressing. So on plain English, every time you start putting policies out, sometimes you boil it down. You got the long policy paper, and then you got the one-page brief, and then you got the bumper sticker slogan, right? And you're using those different levels at different times. So it's very important to pick your jargon or your slogans carefully. And it's useful when you can put some quantitative thing on it. Because then you can't have somebody like Ocasio-Cortez saying, Green New Deal. She steals the brand and waters down the content. And one of the quantitative things she took out was 100% greenhouse gas reductions and 100% clean energy by 2030. She extended it to 2050. Didn't emphasize that because she's saying green electricity by 2030, but that's only 28% of the country's carbon footprint. And then the part she left out was we want to ban all fracking and all new fossil fuel infrastructure. Because if we build that, we're locked in for 40 years and headed toward climate holocaust. So when you have those quantitative slogans, then you can hold the whole discussion to account. So that's one thing there. And now in New York, we've been battling this out on climate legislation. If you look in Counterpunch from about 2 weeks ago Friday, I had a 5,800-word article, sorry it was so long, explaining the debate between the Democrats' bill, which is basically the funded nonprofits are supporting that because they go to the Democrats and say, what are you willing to do? The grassroots movement was saying, here's what we need to do in making that demand. So we got 2 bills. One's called the Climate and Community Protection Act, which is the sellout bill. And then we got the New York Off-Fossil Fuels bill, which came from the anti-fracking movement. This was like our next step. We got a ban on fracking in 2014. Then we wanted to get our own bill in because the other bill the Democrats have had has passed the Assembly every year since 2009. And what it says in there is our goal is to get to 450 parts per million carbon equivalents in the atmosphere. Of course, since about 2008, Bill McKibben formed 350.org because 350 parts per million is the safe zone according to these climate scientists, right? Now, the problem with the politics is McKibben and 350.org are supporting the 450 bill. So, but we can hold them to account. We use their own numbers against them. So that's one of the advantages of having a quantitative anchor to your demands. And then the bills. You look at these 2 bills, and the New York Off-Fossil Fuels, y'all could read it. The New York, the Climate and Community Protection Act, which is the sellout bill, is written by lawyers for lawyers. So you read it, and it's always referring to section so-and-so of this regulation or that law. And then if you actually go look there, it refers you to another section. And you basically got to be a lawyer who knows how to go on the internet or has all the law books on the shelf to figure out what the hell the bill is talking about. And then they do sneaky things like they form a climate justice council. And then you read who's on it, state officials, and organizations that represent disadvantaged communities. Our bill, the New York Off bill, says the council have to be residents of these communities. Big difference. The people, have their own. Now, that's problematic because they'll be appointed by politicians and there's machines and patronage. But at least they got to be people that live in the community. Whereas the other folks, it's basically that bill, the Climate and Community Protection Act, is a way to get money to these nonprofits, not really deal with the problem. So, plain English, that's one point. The other point is you got to talk to the activists working on the issue because they usually know more than we do on a particular issue. For example, to ban fracking demand that we raised in the 2010 gubernatorial campaign in New York in 2010, that came from the people at Ground Zero who are fighting the frackers coming in the Marcellus Shale. And as early as 2008, they were saying, we want a ban on fracking. And not just for water reasons. At that time, most of the environmental movement was saying natural gas is the bridge to a renewable future. It's a lesser evil to coal. And eventually, we had scientists up there in New York who found that natural gas is as bad as coal when you do the whole life cycle of the fuel and account the methane, which is more potent as a greenhouse gas. So that's where the demand came from. And the other part of the environmental movement said, let's do a moratorium and study it. We were calling for a ban, and because we had the energy of the anti-fracking movement, and it was a clear demand, and we were able to explain some of these things, the whole thing caught on. And then, over the next 4 years, we dogged Governor Cuomo, and by 2014, we got the ban on fracking. And that came from the grassroots. It wasn't the Green Party going out and saying, here's the demand. We listened. Of course, some of these people were Greens. We had town councilors. Mary Jo Long, and town councilor in Afton, is one of the people that said, this is what the demand's got to be. What we're doing right now in Syracuse is we're putting forward, it's going to be a referendum. They don't do many of those in New York. Very few people know, but we have to do two huge petitions. We do a petition, put the law to the council, and if they don't adopt it, we do another petition, and it has to go on the ballot. And we got to write the whole law out. But this is a 2-year organizing thing, and the first thing we're doing is we mapped out the city, all the civic groups that might advantage from this, all the political parties, including the Libertarians and the Republicans, because they're disadvantaged by winner-take-all in a mostly Democratic city. So we think they might work with us on this. And then here's the concept, and we're not just talking about ranked choice voting in single-member districts. We're talking about ranked choice voting in multi-member districts for the council so we can get proportional representation. Because if we just get ranked choice voting in single-member districts in a Democratic city like Syracuse, they're still going to dominate all the elected offices. Proportional representation, the Greens will probably be the second party, and the Republicans the third, and the Libertarians the fourth, but we'll all have representation. So we're coming with that concept, but then we're saying, okay, we got 10 seats on the council. To really have good proportional representation, maybe we need 20. And we can tell them the city used to have that till the 30s, and we can talk about why they got rid of it. Business doesn't like to deal with a lot of elected officials. It's easier to buy 10 than 20, right? So we're going to go around for the next 6 months and talk to civic groups. Which kind of proportional representation? Here are the options. And in the process of educating them about the concepts, let them help pick the actual details. And then people buy in, because then everybody's involved in the process. And it's also important to go to grassroots. And I don't know what I'm doing on time, but I'm going to stop with this point. If you bring in the grassroots people, they don't have a vested interest in selling out. My favorite example is Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Bob Moses, mathematician from Harvard, organizing Freedom Summer, organizing the Freedom Democratic Party. And everybody assumed, he'd be the leader. But he said, no, you're going to elect your own. And who they elect? Well, Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the co-chairs. And then when Johnson offered a compromise where you don't get seated, the Dixiecrats get seated, but we'll give you 2 honorary seats so you can wander around the convention and talk to people. And Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph said, take the deal. It's an advance forward. And maybe for the middle class folks, they're starting getting their foot in the industry, into the Democratic Party that way. Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper, said, no, we came here for votes. We came here for power. And this is not what we came for. And she convinced the delegation to reject the compromise. That's what happens when the grassroots people are involved, not the professional, liberal staffers in these nonprofit groups that, if you trace back who they're funded by, it's the corporate liberal billionaires. So I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I've got 10 minutes left. Yeah, I think I put out 2 concepts, plain English and talk to the grassroots to get your policy and then eventually your legislation formulated. So that's all I got in 20 minutes, but I think we probably have some discussion to, talk about, what I brought up, what concerns you about it.
I'll moderate here. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah. In Pinellas, we've been working with DSA and some with Extinction Rebellion. And talking up the Green New Deal. And the issue that we're discovering is, the question is this a narrowly environmental bill? Or what about that economic Bill of Rights, this housing, healthcare? Is that just some language we tacked on? But, you know, it's just to sound nice. And when I go to these groups, I say that stuff is central, because if you don't tackle that stuff, then none of it goes.
I agree with you totally. That's the politics of getting climate action passed. You got to reassure the people that's struggling that they're not even going to get hurt more. That's why the fracking ban in Colorado failed, in part because the industry was able to pit jobs versus the environment. The carbon tax in Washington, the gasoline tax in France, the yellow vests rebelling, and that is what we got to reassure people, because that's where the resistance will come from. And so the politics, I appreciate the fact that Ocasio-Cortez kept some of that link to the Economic Bill of Rights. When we first were campaigning for it in 2010 in New York, we're coming out of the Great Recession. So the top thing was the economic stuff. And then we said the way to stimulate the economy was to invest in clean energy. So we led with the economic justice and counterposed, we were calling it the Hawkins prosperity plan versus the Cuomo austerity plan. Because his answer to the recession with revenues down was to cut programs, cut school funding, furlough workers, and so forth. And so we offered that as an alternative. And I think politically, that's the only way you can build a coalition that can get the whole package passed. So, you know, I think we have to fight like hell. There are people who say the climate is the biggest issue, so we just got to focus narrowly on that and get the economic justice stuff later. But if we don't bring them together, we're not going to have the political coalition that will get any of it done.
All right, thank you very much for that, Jeff Roby from Pinellas County. We're going to take two more questions here. Up the stack, we had Steve Newman. He had his hand up a little bit earlier from Brevard.
In Florida, the Republican legislature is trying to shut down petition ballot initiatives. I've seen several petitions circulating around $15 an hour, some gun things. About 4 petitions I've seen consistently. I've seen a guy out, a couple of people out in front of the voter polling place, the county place there in my county, with a table set up every day, petition, getting people to sign these petitions. I think it's a Democratic Party initiative. I'd like to see Green Party start doing this a little more. I'd like to know if you have any thoughts about that and what might be a good one to start with.
You mean for a citizens initiative, a statewide citizens initiative?
Yeah.
Like the whole electoral system, there's a problem with that in that it takes a lot of money to get on a ballot. California does like 25 of them every year. And it's usually millions of dollars and special interests that finance the petitioning. And the progressive initiatives are usually underfunded. And then all people hear about it is what they hear from the advertising. They never sit down together and talk to each other about what they need and how they feel about these things. There was a proposal from a political scientist named Benjamin Barber back in the day, like 30 years ago. There was a book called Strong Democracy, where he said in order to vote on a referendum in his proposal, you had to go to a town meeting like they have in New England, all the citizens in a township, you know, a community. And in order to vote, you had to be there for the discussion, the pros and cons, so that, you know, regular people could have an in-depth discussion instead of these 30-second ads, which are, you know, are very often basically lies, you know, distortions. So that's the problem when you have mass democracy or plebiscites, you know, where people get to vote on an option, but they don't really have a chance to think it through and talk to each other. Plebiscites have been used by Hitler, Saddam Hussein, you know, dictators, in order to get legitimacy for what they're doing, because, you know, people don't have, all they hear is one side of the story. So that's the problem with that. I like initiatives locally like we're doing in Syracuse because people aren't as atomized and massified as opposed to a huge state like Florida. So that's just a comment on the whole process. Now, whether the Greens should do it, I think it depends on the issue and circumstances and your other options. It's just because that's a tactical question, and I don't think there's an abstract answer that fits all cases.
All right, we have one more question. This is going to come from Robin Harris, co-chair of the Green Party of Florida, out of Central Florida.
Yeah, so I can kind of appreciate what everybody's saying, but I really need an elementary example of. So we have an issue. We kind of worked on one for like housing. We had an issue around housing. Where do we extract the language from that ensures that it becomes a resolution or a bill so that when we present it, we know that it's becoming, I guess even before it gets to the referendums or a ballot initiative, what we're saying qualifies it to become legislation, if that makes sense, or a policy.
Now, is this municipal or state?
Any of it.
Okay. Well, when you get to the point where you've got your policy, where I think you need to talk to the grassroots, get clear amongst ourselves what we want, and really clear, then you go to find legislators who can get the lawyers who write these bills for the legislature, and then you got to watch them because you want them to write it in enough plain English that your activists around your city or your state can actually read it, understand it, and talk to people about it. So that's a struggle with the lawyers who like to talk in their own world and mystify stuff. I mean, I don't know if I've defended myself in criminal stuff, basically related to civil disobedience, traffic court, and I never said this to a judge. I have a friend who represents himself too. He told a judge one time, this ain't rocket science, because the judge couldn't believe his legal brief was he wrote it himself. He thought some lawyer did it for him. So the lawyers are kind of fooling themselves sometimes. So we just got to, basically say, if you can't explain it to me, we can't explain it to the people. So it's got to be plain. But once you got your policy in your own words, then you find a legislator who's willing to work with you. Now, this is another point that's worth knowing. We got the New York Off Fossil Fuels bill. We didn't go to the leadership because they had their own bill. It goes back to 2009. It's a sellout bill. And they got an agenda there. They want to say they did something without really doing something. We had to find legislators in the Democratic Party who, we run against. But these are people sort of mid-level or what they call backbenchers. Like one of them, he lived in a district in Queens that got flooded by Hurricane Sandy. His people wanted him to do something. So we were able to go to him and say, here's what we've been working on. And we worked with him, and he helped us get to the lawyers that draft these bills. And then the parts of it where they were making these references to other laws, we were saying, no, you got to write it in the law so people understand what you're saying. So you go to legislators and you get it to the lawyers, and then you got to insist that it come back in a way that you can use it with your organizing so that politically you can get it passed. So that's what we do. We get an idea, and then and the other thing I can tell you in the city of Syracuse, we got a legal staff that's lazy. They always want to tell us, you can't do that. Even though, and another thing, while I think of it, there is a progressive equivalent of ALEC. You all have heard of ALEC, right? The American Legislative Exchange Council, and they draft these bills. So these right-wingers, they get, they just change it, and they have a local lawyer tweak this and that so it fits the city or state. There's a progressive version of that, whose name I forget right now. But National Conference of State and Local Legislators or something like that. You're looking at me like you know.
I know, I was just getting ready to write it down.
Okay.
You got 1 minute, Howie.
All right. Well, that is a very useful source. Like if you're dealing with a housing issue, they might have model legislation that gives you a concept of what you're thinking about that you can use as a starting point or give to your city lawyers if you're at that stage. And I'll get on the Google machine here and try to find the exact. It was called the National Conference of State and Local Legislators back in the early 70s. It was very useful. They used to put out these things before internet, these booklets. And actually, ALEC is modeled after them. It's just more people know about ALEC because they got that right-wing money. And the progressives don't have much for this kind of thing.
It's still NCSL.
Okay. National Conference of State and Local Legislators. So you're a former city school board member. Did you use it at all?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are models there, and they have people, developing policy and model legislation. So that's a real resource. I haven't actually looked at it myself recently, but back in the 70s, it was, we were doing anti-nuclear stuff and safe energy stuff. It was very helpful. And housing stuff. We had a coalition in New Hampshire that was a multi-issue coalition. I was trying to get it to be the state affiliate of the People's Party, but we were dealing with housing, welfare rights, clean energy, and that was the source for us.
Thank you, Howie.
All right, thanks.
Thank you so much.